And the winner of the Cuny scholarship of $2,000 is Mia Holly, and her faculty advisor is Jerry Hester, who's going to introduce her.
Thank you, Joe. Thank you, Joe, and hi, everybody. It's great to be here. I have the honor of introducing you to Mia. My name is Jerry Hester. I'm the editorial director at the Craig Newmark Graduate School of Journalism at the City University of New York, which is a really long name. But for everybody who knows and loves us, we're Cuny J School. I'm also the interim director of our new local accountability reporting program, which I'm glad to say Mia is a part of. Mia's 25. She's a New Jersey native. She previously managed Morpho Magazine, a print and digital publication by and for women and non-binary people of color. Mia is also part of our data journalism specialization, and she is among our first Revson Fellow data scholars. Her goal is to produce deeply reported stories about underserved communities, and she's already going a long way to doing that. She has written for the Mott Haven Herald about a bid to ban New York City's washeros, otherwise known as unlicensed mobile car washers. She's written for, I love that name. If you've ever seen them in action, it's amazing. And she's written for City and State, where she's interned, about local women politicians facing bias over the way they dress. She's also written for our New York City News Service about an anonymous donation that saved the composting program. And if she seems a little tired, and I don't think she does, that's because she was out late last night at the Graduate Center where pro-Palestinian protesters briefly took over the library. I'm also proud to report that Mia, as a Revson Data Fellow, is set to internship this summer with our friends at Chalkbeat. So without any ado, let me turn you over to Mia.
So thank you everyone for having me here today. I feel very grateful to be recognized by the Press Club and to be in the company of so many inspiring journalists. I'd also like to thank the Newmark J School for helping me, as well as other emerging journalists, on our route to reporting deeply reported stories. And I'd also like to thank Jerry for being an incredible faculty advisor. So I'll be brief, but I wanted to share an anecdote from when I applied to the Newmark J School, because I think it's kind of fitting for this event. So when I did apply to the J School last year, I led with an anecdote from my teenage years, and that anecdote being watching Half the Sky when I was 13 years old. And that documentary, which was based on Nick Kristof's investigative work across the globe, really inspired me to become a journalist. And obviously, it's pretty ironic that I'm now here sitting in the same room as him, so I feel a bit grateful for that. But you know, what really stood out to me at that point in time in my life was access. And I think about that a lot now as a journalism student, how we attain access to our sources, how we care for our sources, and what we choose to do with that information once we do have access to our sources. And so as a student, I've had the opportunity to report on Bronx neighborhoods where many residents face some of the most pertinent issues of our time. My stories include breaking news pieces about the precarious nature of New York City's composting programs, as Jerry mentioned. But I've also been able to report on new police department units responding to NYCHA violence. I've also written long-form stories about the mental health toll that city shelter systems take on workers and migrants, as well as librarian shortages at public schools. And so behind these stories are very passionate environmentalists or library specialists fighting to save their workplaces, parents concerned about the safety of their schools for their children, social workers facing chronic fatigue, and more. These are not easy stories to tell anyone, not least a journalist. And so access is no longer a fascinating feat that inspired me to become a journalist, but it is a responsibility that I assume. And I look forward to being able to tell more, or being able to have the opportunity to handle more stories with care and keep the powerful to account. Thank you. Thank you. I appreciate it.
Before I present the award, I'd like to tell you a little bit about Peter. Better still, I'll let Bob McFadden do it by reading from a remembrance Bob wrote of his colleague taking on the lead story the night of the 1965 blackout. No, you're too young to remember it, Ryan. Here he comes, long-legged, gangly, sweeping into the newsroom in his rumpled old jacket, the awful necktie askew, smudged glasses all but falling off his nose. His shoulders are stooped, as if compensating for the too tall frame and the big baldish head. His collar, as usual, is frayed. He looks more like an old-world clockmaker than one of America's best reporters. As he confers with editors in the flickering candlelight at the city desk, Peter flips open his notebook, filled with scribbles in the tiny, spidery hand of a depression kid saving paper. He has an agreeable smile despite the hopeless situation, but in the golden glow of the candles, Peter is calm. He moves to his front row desk, settles behind the typewriter, and cradles a phone to his ear. Isn't that lovely? Peter, whose 50-year career included the Associated Press, the World Telegram and Sun, and for 30 years the New York Times, was the consummate reporter. A sharp-eyed noticer able to vacuum up countless colorful or telling details to make a person or an event come to life, no matter how tight the deadline. He was fastidious about clicking to the principles of objectivity, fairness, and integrity. As a result, he was an inspiration to dozens of his colleagues, more than a few have told me they considered him a mentor. And the Peter Kissch Award is for both a distinguished career and for mentorship. His son Eric is here, and I call him up to say a few words. Eric?
Well, I'm really honored to be able to attend this dinner, and instead of talking about what my dad did professionally and his stories, I'll talk a little bit about what a person he was at home and how I didn't know how well regarded he was until he had his first heart attack when I was in college. And all of a sudden, Arthur Gelb was every day at the hospital in a limousine. And aside from occasional sensational stories like the blackout story, which he got the Page One Award for, or the Malcolm X assassination, he mostly did a lot of stories that did not interest me as a music major in college. The city budget, things like that. So when he had his first heart attack, Mayor Lindsay at the time sent him a copy of the city budget, this thick, to Peter, who I know will read it. And of course my father did, and found either a page or a paragraph missing, and apparently sent everybody in City Hall scrambling for their copies of the budget, which nobody had looked at either. Anyway, I'll make this brief. He would never tell me who he would vote for in an election as a reporter. He tried to be objective, but I know he was very, very upset with and devastated by Robert Kennedy's death. But one of the letters I have hanging on my wall was from Richard Nixon, who was no fan of reporters. And it was apparently a piece, let me find the article here. It's a framed letter. He was writing a profile of the Nixon family in 1963 that pleased the future president. And in it, Nixon says, the best newspaper reporters are objective, fair, and considerate, particularly when they're writing about a man's family and personal life. And he also put in P.S. Checkers like the piece too. Anyway, he was very self-deprecating, and in Arthur Gelb's book, amazingly enough, he would return down raises and salary, thinking he was undeserving. When he was forced to retire at age 70, he thought it's a young man's game anyway, that he did not object to it in any way. And he really was reluctant to, when this award was created, he was still alive. He died in 1984, and he didn't even want this to happen. But I'm glad it did, and I can't think of a more deserving person than Nicholas Kristof to be this year's winner. Thank you.
Nick Kristof has always embodied the spirit of Peter Keyes, except that Peter Keyes' domain was New York City, while Nick's has been the planet Earth. He's traveled to 150 countries, 150 countries. I didn't know there were 150 countries. All 50 American states. His dispatches, whether as a reporter or a columnist, display an exceptional sensitivity to human misery, poverty, and pain, the hunger and genocide in Darfur, children forced into prostitution in Cambodia, India, and the United States, the opioid crisis in rural America. He has inspired and mentored many young journalists, and since 2006, he's been taking young college students and high school teachers to various African countries as the reward in an essay contest sponsored by the Times. Along the way, he won 2 Pulitzer Prizes, one of which he shared with his wife, Cheryl Wu Dunn. Nick will talk about his memoir, Chasing Hope, A Reporter's Life, which chronicles his dispatches from Tiananmen Square, the Yemeni Civil War, the Darfur genocide in Sudan, and many other spots where human rights and the vulnerable have been endangered. Yet despite all the tragedies and calamities he's documented, Nick has not despaired. As he wrote in last Sunday's opinion section, some people see my career covering massacres and oppression and assume that I must be dour and infused with misery, a journalistic Eeyore. Not so. Journalism is an act of hope. Why else would reporters rush toward gunfire, visit COVID wards, or wade into riots to interview arsonists? We do all this because we believe that better outcomes are possible if we just get people to understand more clearly what's going on. Nick, come up, please. I want to give you the award. Now, as a further reward, we'll subject you to a grilling by our Silurians governor and your former reporting colleague, David Andelman, a correspondent for the Times in Bangkok and Belgrade, and for NBC News in Paris, where he makes his enviable home much of the year. Come on, David.
I certainly don't need to introduce you, since everyone, especially in this room, who doesn't know you has been living under a rock.